as you know, today we are going to concentrate on these 8 verses of mind training. In Tibetan, mind training is called Lojong. But although it says mind training, it's really more attitude training. It's not a mental exercise. It's about how to transform our habitual, rather negative responses, especially when things go badly, into something much more positive. And in other words, how to take difficulties onto our spiritual path, rather than seeing difficulties, difficult situations, difficult people especially, as somehow an obstacle to our practice. We can recognize that in many ways they're a very essential component of our practice. If we only practice when everything is nice and people are friendly, then that's not really practice. So this way of taking difficult circumstances, difficult people, and using them as our spiritual practice was particularly introduced into Tibet during the 11th century by a great Bengali scholar practitioner called Dipankara Atisha. And he actually was now, I think he was born in Chittagong, so he's actually Bangladeshi. But of course in those days that was Bengal. And he studied for many, many years in not only in India, in the great Buddhist universities of those days, such as Nalanda and Vikramashila, but also he spent many, many years, 12 years, 15 years, in Sumatra, in Indonesia. And it's there that he studied these mind training teachings. Then he came back and he was invited to Tibet, but he didn't really want to go. He was by this time in his 50s. The journey to Tibet was very difficult. He didn't speak Tibetan anyway. And he just felt he was too old for that sort of adventures. But meantime, the king, Yeshe in western Tibet, he was captured by his enemies and they put him up for ransom. So then they said they had to present the equivalent of his head weight in gold to ransom the king. So then his son went around and gathered that much gold to offer. And then his father said, no, I'm old anyway, it doesn't matter about me. You take this gold that you have gathered and take it to India and again petition Atisha to come. So that, and tell him that, you know, I have done this in order that he should bring Dharma to Tibet. So that's what they did. Meantime, the king was beheaded because they didn't come up with the ransom. And so when Atisha, of course, heard that the king had sacrificed his life in order to invite him to Tibet, what could he do? And likewise, the deity that he was very close to, who was the goddess Tara, the Buddha Tara, she also told him he should go to Tibet. So off to Tibet he went. And he had an enormous influence on Tibetan Buddhism there. Of course, it had already been introduced and established in the 8th century. But he emphasized especially the very basics of how, before we do any of these high tantric practices and all these fancy stuff, we really have to get a strong foundation in genuine compassion and taking refuge in Buddha Dharma Sangha and really transforming our minds before we start doing all this other fancy stuff. So his tradition actually died out eventually in Tibet, but the teachings and texts from that tradition were incorporated into all the other lineages. So everybody practices that, and everybody reveres Palden very much for his tremendous help in establishing Tibetan Buddhism, really with the emphasis on compassion and not on gaining powers, which is also often happens on the tantric path. It becomes a thing about becoming more powerful and the ego becoming bigger. And Atisha really kept people, look, you know, it's all about non-ego and about developing qualities to benefit others, not about our own self-promotion. With the result that Tibetan Buddhism stayed really very much on the path and produced very, very great masters down to the present day. So this actual text was not written by Atisha himself. It was written by a disciple of a disciple of a disciple called Langri Tangpa. But it coalesces into a very short form the basic ideas, and people such as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, etc., always as part of their practice every morning recite these 8 verses because it sets tone for the day. And then when difficulties come, one can recall this verse and remind oneself how to respond in a skillful manner instead of just getting all upset and angry and defensive. So he starts right off by thinking of all, I will read it first, which kind of gives, in a Tibetan tradition, one is not supposed to read a text until it's been read to you by someone who themselves has had that text read to them, all the way back to the author. So sometimes, even if it's, 600 pages 1,000 years ago, you still have, it's like lighting the candle. They got the match, they lit the candle, then that candle lit the flame, and so forth. So every time there's that connection back to the author themselves. So, of course, nowadays, especially with all these texts being translated, it's kind of, but still, within the Tibetan community, if you want to study a text, you have to go and find someone to give you this oral transmission. So I will just read it quickly, and then we'll go through it verse by verse. By thinking of all sentient beings as more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel for accomplishing the highest aim, I will always hold them dear. Whenever I'm in the company of others, I will regard myself as the lowest among all, and from the depths of my heart cherish others as supreme. In my every action, I will watch my mind, and the moment destructive emotions arise, I will confront them strongly and avert them, since they will hurt both me and others. Whenever I see ill-natured beings or those overwhelmed by heavy misdeeds or suffering, I will cherish them as something rare, as though I found a priceless treasure. Whenever someone out of envy does me wrong by attacking or belittling me, I will take defeat upon myself and give the victory to others. Even when someone I have helped or in whom I have placed great hopes mistreats me very unjustly, I will view that person as a true spiritual teacher. In brief, directly or indirectly, I will offer help and happiness to all my mothers and secretly take upon myself all their hurt and suffering. I will learn to keep all these practices untainted by thoughts of the 8 worldly concerns, and may I recognize all things as illusions, and without attachment, gain freedom from bondage. So we start with verse 1. These halls never have clocks. I know, but it's hidden by, Okay, so the direction of all our good wishes, of all our compassion, of all our empathy is directed to all sentient beings. That means all conscious beings, all beings with consciousness. So that means certainly not just our own clan, our own caste, our own family, our own race, or even just all human beings. It also means all animals, all insects, beings that live in rivers and oceans, beings that live in the sky, beings that live under the earth, beings not only in this realm, but in the many other realms of beings that we can't see, the heavenly realms and the lower realms, and of course throughout the universe, because the universe obviously contains many, many beings which we know nothing about. So all sentient beings encompasses everything which has consciousness, because to all beings, their own self is most precious, is most dear. Even an insect, you have a mosquito, and the mosquito wants to have supper and splush. But you know, that insect's life is now completely gone. And yet for that insect, its own life was very precious, and it was very important for that insect. It was all it had. So we should be more careful, recognizing that every single being that we meet, not only all the other human beings, but also animals and insects and fish and birds, each one holds themselves most dear and doesn't want to be hurt, just as we do not want to be hurt. And so even if we cannot help them, at least we could try to be careful not to harm. That's the basis on which all of this is based. The fact that each being holds themselves as most precious and doesn't want to be hurt, just as we do not want anyone harming us. What being wants to be harmed? So that, as I say, is the most important foundation on which everything else follows. We're not just thinking humans, but also animals, insects, birds, fish, and so forth. All beings. So, by thinking of all sentient beings as more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel for accomplishing the highest aim, I will hold them dear. Now, as you know, being Indians, a wish-fulfilling jewel was that which is this mythical jewel which, if we have it, fulfills all our wishes. So if we want endless wealth, if we want our children to come number one in the exams, if we want somebody we love to be free from their sickness, and so forth, this wish-fulfilling jewel can fulfill all our wishes. What it cannot do is give us enlightenment. It cannot give us spiritual benefits. This wish-fulfilling jewel can only give us mundane, worldly benefits. Money, good health, beauty, but it cannot give us inner realizations. It cannot give us liberation. Who can are all these other beings, if we treat them properly, if we understand how. Therefore, they are much more precious in the long run than a mere wish-fulfilling jewel, which can only satisfy, well, it never can satisfy the endless cravings for this lifetime. But it's not going to get us awake. It's not going to help us to really inwardly transform ourselves and go beyond our ordinary greedy, angry, self-concerned, self-cherishing mind. It can't do that. But if we relate properly with all the beings around us, we can use them as our means to transform our own mind. And by transforming our own mind, we begin to wake up. And since in order to wake up, we do need other people, therefore, other people, other beings are more precious to us than even a jewel which grants all our worldly desires. So therefore, instead of seeing other people as the obstacle to our path, this is very important. Instead of thinking of other people as the obstacle to our path, we recognize that they are the path. That learning how to deal skillfully, especially with unskillful people, is how we learn and how we begin to mature and grow up and begin to really cultivate genuine compassion. Because, of course, it's always very easy to be friendly and loving and kind to people who are friendly, loving, and kind. Anybody can do that. It doesn't require anything. You know, if someone's nice to you, you're likely to be nice back. But the real challenge for us all is to recognize that the people who are the most difficult for us, on one level, are actually our greatest helpers on the spiritual path, because they are the people who are going to help us to really challenge our own ideas about, you know, how we should be treated by others, and our very self-cherishing mind. So this whole text is dealing, as you can see, with exactly that. So therefore, by thinking of all sentient beings as more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel for accomplishing the highest aim in Buddhism is to wake up, to become a Buddha. Buddha means to waken. So it's not a matter of going off and going into Mahasamadhi for years and months and centuries. It's a matter of waking up, of actually resourcing our own innate wisdom, compassion mind, so that we are able to see things how they really are, and not the way that it is normally processed by our senses and our brain, which is very egocentric. The way we live is always revolving around me, 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 me. What I like, what I want, what I don't want, what is good for me. So the whole time we are thinking I. As somebody pointed out yesterday, in the English language at least, I is the one word which is always capitalized. And I mean, that, of course, not in all languages is that true, but it says something, you know? You, them, him, her, small letters. I, meantime. So, because we live our life with the I standing supreme and everything running around it, we don't see things how they really are, either externally or internally. We are deluded in our thinking. So we are asleep. We are just dreaming, really, with all our deluded ideas and memories and opinions and so forth. So always the idea is to wake up, to finally see things with a whole different level of consciousness, of awareness, to see things how they really are. And that immediately demotes the I from a big capital letter right down into a very empty, spacious interconnection, instead of being so solitary and supreme in all the world. So therefore, sentient beings, because they help us to do this, they help us to gather this inner wisdom. Therefore, they are far more precious than anything which can just give us worldly desires, which just increases our greed anyway. So for that reason, I will hold them dear. Meaning that because we rely on other beings to help us on the path on many levels, even if one is living in isolation, one still relies on other people, to deal with supplies and working in the fields to make, to grow the crops, and just the whole internet. What to speak of if you're living within a city or in a society, we rely constantly on other beings because nobody can do everything. Even just to go and buy a kilo of rice, that has actually required enormous amounts of cooperation from enormous amounts of people, from the farmers to the animals who are pulling the plows, to the people that they're selling their seed to the people who are hitting the crop, and all the shopkeepers and whatever's in between. I mean, if we think about it, and plus the insects who are irrigating the soil and so forth, it just is infinite, just one thing. So we rely on other beings constantly. And so just to survive on this planet, we need so many helpers, seen and unseen. So we should be grateful. All these people are working together in interconnection so that we can keep living. However, verse 2, whenever I am in the company of others, I will regard myself as the lowest among all, and from the depths of my heart cherish others as supreme. So again, this has to be understood. First of all, these texts were written by important monks in their day, who everybody held as being very important and were very polite to and seated on the highest seats and always treated very, very well. And so if they're not careful, they get a little bit proud, And of course, before that, in India, so many of these high scholars, even in the Buddhist world, were Brahmins or high caste. And so they took it for granted that they were superior to everybody. Nothing much has changed. So therefore, for them, it was very salutary to think that, everybody else is more important than me. But really what it is saying, it doesn't really have anything to do with class or caste. What it's saying is that, in general, when we meet with others, so often it happens that people are thinking, I wonder what they think of me. And we are listening to our thoughts and our opinions of that other person. And that other person is only important insofar as what they can do for me and my opinion of them. In other words, even when we are in society with others, we are still the center of our universe. And it's our opinions of them and what we perceive as their opinions of us which count. In other words, it's all me, me, me. even when we're with others. And so this again creates, it creates a barrier. Because often you meet people and you can see they're not really listening to you. Or you're not really listening to them. You're just waiting for the time to give your opinion. Have you noticed? It's very rare to meet someone who absolutely empties out inwardly and just listens. Because they are not thinking of themselves, they are not thinking of what clever response they can give, they are not judging, they are just listening. And the other person is important. Themselves are not important. And that's what this means. It's not about high and low as far as, you know, social status or caste or anything. It's to do with whoever we are with. At that moment, that person is the most important person in the universe for us because it's the person we are with. One sees that very much, for example, with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Any of you who ever met His Holiness will know what I mean. Even when he's walking out and meeting like a crowd of people, and he will go to one person or another and hold their hand and look at them in the eyes, in that moment, that person, well, I mean, they feel sort of lit up, but afterwards they recognize it's because in that moment, they were the only person that existed for His Holiness. And he wasn't judging them. So he treats, I mean, he can treat the President of the United States the same as he'll treat one of the policemen guarding him. To him, they're all the same. They're just human beings with problems and difficulties and triumphs and joys and sorrows. In that moment, only that he's looking at the person behind the facade. And so for many people, it melts them. And for other people, especially those who are very caught up in their facade, it's very challenging. You can often see these politicians beside him looking very uptight. You know, because they find it very challenging to be with someone who is not interested that you're the chief minister of that or you're the this or that. Just looking at the person behind it all, behind the mask. But with love, not with judgment. He sees the person there. And so that tremendous compassion comes through. Because he's not thinking, oh, I'm the Dalai Lama, I hope they're impressed. You know, you can see he could care less. The only person that matters at that moment for him is the person that he's speaking to. And he speaks to them again, not in a way which categorizes them, decides they're better than me, they're worse than me, they're as good as me, nothing like that. But just with an open-hearted fellowship and compassion. So that's what this is talking about. It's not talking about, you know, that we should all develop an inferiority complex and consider ourselves to be unworthy, or everybody's better than me and I'm no use, or, you know, as a counterbalance to thinking I'm so special and who are these people, they're of no significance. It's not dealing with that. It's dealing with the fact that when we meet people at that moment, that person is of supreme importance. And we ourselves, therefore, step out the way. You know, and sometimes when people meet people, you can see, they're not seeing that person at all. They are like a monolith. It's there, me. You know, and everybody else is just an extension of me. And so it's, get out the way. Let the other person shine in their own light. Why are we blocking that other person? So all other people, not just people of our own social status or people that we think are attractive or important or of some benefit to us in some way. But to recognize that all beings that we meet, as I said, to each being, their own self is most precious. Doesn't matter who they are in the worldly sense. And to respect that. Respect that each one of us is really, we have so much more in common than merely our education and our social status and our race and all these, even our gender or any of these things. That is trivial compared with what we have in common with each other. So therefore, when we meet anyone, we should have that sense of inner friendliness and kindness. You know, Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That sums it up. And in the Jewish, they turn it the other way around. In the Old Testament, it says, don't do to others what you wouldn't have them do to you. And it means all others, not just people in our own social stratosphere. Because all beings, when you look in their eyes, there they are. So this verse is a very important one to remember, to when we meet with other people, to put them at the forefront. And as I said, as it were, to step out of the way, step out of their light, let their light shine. And even if it's only for a moment, there is that connection. I mean, as I say, you know, sometimes people meet with people like His Holiness or others, and it's just for a moment, you know, it's just going by, but they look at you and smile, and sometimes it transforms their whole life. It doesn't have to be a long, you know, sessions. In that moment, there is that openness and acceptance with love. And that's what, in the end, we're all looking for, is to be accepted as we are and loved despite it all. So for each of us, we can practice this. This is why sentient beings are so important for us. Because we have, you know, it's very easy to close ourselves off, especially those living in the city. They feel overwhelmed. There are just too many sentient beings out there. And so we tend to, you know, make a little fortress around ourselves. And, you know, and this is saying, don't do that. It doesn't mean that we rush out and hug everybody that we meet in the street. But it does mean that when we are meeting with anybody for any reason, then we should do so with a heart which is kind and wishes the other well and is non-judgmental and is not thinking in terms of what are they thinking about me, or, you know, how am I judging them. Doesn't mean that we have to be naive, right? I mean, obviously, if we're in business or if we're, you know, we don't have to just be in fantasy world about this. But even if we see somebody is not to be trusted, then we, rather than just become very negative, even though we are now cautious because we know they're trying to cheat us, for example, nonetheless, we recognizing that and thinking what it must be like to have a mind which is always trying to cheat others. How sad. So then instead of reacting with anger, or we can feel a sense of compassion for them. It doesn't mean we let ourselves be cheated. But we don't have to get all uptight and angry about it. We can think, well, what were the causes that created this person who goes around doing that sort of thing? You know, we don't know their history. So basically, it's just dealing with how to open up the heart to recognize that everybody we meet, really, we need to look at them with unprejudiced eyes and recognize that high or low, far or near, we as beings all really would rather be treated well than to be treated badly. We know that. Just as we don't want people to be mean to us, then why are we mean to others? I mean, it's obvious if we think about it. As I say, that does not mean that if we're in an abusive situation, we just allow people to get away with being abusive. But it does mean how within that can we bring a certain clarity to the situation so that we can deal with the situations skillfully instead of creating more problems and just arousing more difficulties and anger and so forth. I mean, as we can see, is happening right now in the world with the politics with what happened in Paris. I mean, the reaction was that of children in kindergarten. You know, you hit me, I'll hit you harder. And then, you know, you just end up with this huge wall in which more and more kids get caught up in it. And in the end, you're all just fighting each other and scratching each other. And, you know, is that supposed to be a solution? Politicians are no more spiritually advanced than anybody, if even that. And it's, you know, the whole world is controlled by people whose own minds are totally out of control. Hence our problems. But each one of us from our own side can learn to grow up and be more in control of the situation and not act like a bunch of children in kindergarten. So, in my every action, I will watch my mind, and the moment destructive emotions arise, I will confront them strongly and avert them, since they will hurt both me and others. So then this is a very basic instruction. All of our actions, our speech, and our physical actions depend on prior intention. And intention comes from the mind. So therefore, if we have negative thoughts, we are likely to speak negatively and act negatively. Likewise, if we have wholesome thoughts, then we are likely to have skillful speech and kind actions. So the fact is that most of us, even though we live within our mind the whole time, we're always thinking. But most of us are not really very conscious of what is going on in our mind and what kind of thoughts we normally dwell with. Because a lot of our attention goes out through the sense doors to what we're seeing and hearing and tasting and touching, smelling, etc. And then our thoughts are tumultuously running along, putting it all together, making sense of our external reality, and at the same time being caught up in the past, all our memories and our ideas and our things which happened, you know, an hour ago, a day ago, a year ago, a lifetime ago, or else we're planning and hoping and fearing for the future. The one place we have a hard time dwelling is right now, here. And so even our memories, of course, are very distorted. I mean, we think we remember how things were, but if we meet someone else who happened to be around at that time and we say what happened, and they say, no, it wasn't like that at all. And they have a whole different version of what happened. Of course, they're wrong, but nonetheless, they're mistaken memories. So we cannot even rely on what we think, and yet we believe it. Because I think this, it must be true. This is how beliefs come about, right? Because I think it. If I think it, then it's right. And we don't even question that. We don't even look. And during the day, the whole time, we are swimming in this ocean of thoughts, feelings, memories, anticipations. But mostly, we're not even aware of what we are thinking. And that very much influences how we relate to others, how we relate to circumstances, what we say, and what we do. All of it comes from the mind. We cannot perform an action without a prior intention. Even if it's so quick, we normally don't notice it. But actually, before we say or do anything, there has to be a mental intention there for the body to respond, or the vocal organs to formulate speech. So it's not just enough to put a guard on our physical actions and our speech, as yesterday we were speaking about ethics and the ethics of not killing and stealing and being careful with our speech. But the prime source is our mind. And so therefore it's very important for us to begin to observe the mind. Now, of course, there are meditations where we can just sit and look at the mind for a shorter or longer period. But especially also during the day, we should have times when we just turn the attention in. And in this moment, what am I thinking? Just look. In the monastery, the ashram of Thich Nhat Hanh, they have something called a mindfulness bell, which goes ding, and then everybody stops what they're doing for just a few moments. And how is the body? What is the mind doing in this moment? Apparently you can get that appliance on your phone. You can have a mindfulness bell on your phone, and it will again just go ding. And I mean, you don't have to, especially not in your office or if you're cooking. But what one does is at that moment one just brings one's mind back into the present. In this moment, what is one doing? Physically, verbally, but especially mentally. What is the mind doing? And then, when destructive emotions arise, destructive emotions is this translation here for the word klesha. Klesha meaning something which afflicts us, which torments us. And so the kleshas are those negative emotions like our greed and grasping and anger, frustration, annoyance, aversion, all that cycle. And then jealousy, envy, somebody gets something I want, and so instead of feeling pleased for them, we feel upset and angry, and why didn't that happen for me? Why is it given to them? And pride. Pride in Buddhism doesn't just mean thinking that we are better than someone else. It also includes thinking we're worse than someone else, or that we're just as good as someone else. In other words, it's this feeling of I, again, at the center of everything, comparing ourselves endlessly with everybody else we meet. That sense that, you know, everybody else fits in accordance with my own assessment of who I am. So therefore, I am better than that one. I'm superior, but then I meet somebody else, and now I'm inferior. Or else, you know, we're thinking, well, I'm just as good as everybody else. All of it is a klesha, because it is, again, me, 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 me. So, and the underlying klesha, which is our ignorant delusion of not seeing things clearly and relating everything back to this sense of an I. This I which sits in the center of everything, and which we somehow assume to be unchanging, solid, real, and the ultimate center of who we are, which from a Buddhist perspective is our ultimate ignorance, that we don't see things properly. So also these texts are helping us to begin to dissolve this sense of an autonomous, solid, enduring, unchanging me at the center of everything, which, if we search for it, it cannot be discovered. So again, we have to look at our mind. And when we see that our mind is overtaken with annoyance, aversion, upsets, or we're becoming very greedy and caught up in all our desires and wants, or we're upset because, as I say, somebody got something we wanted, and why should they have it? Or any of these kind of very negative anxieties and negative feelings that we have in our heart. The first thing is to recognize it. If we don't recognize it, then it will just feed on itself and increase and increase and increase and take over. So the sooner we can recognize when a negative emotion arises in the heart, the quicker we can deal with it. Because it's especially certain emotions, dark emotions, they're like a cancer. They just take over everything after a while. They destroy all the goodness in us. So it's very important to recognize these feelings as they come as soon as possible. So the only way we can recognize is by looking, by putting a searchlight, illuminating the mind with our observation, by watching the mind and very truthfully seeing what's going on in the here at this moment. And if it is something negative, then to try to uproot it. First we have to recognize it, then we have to accept it. Right now I'm feeling angry, or right now I'm feeling really quite greedy, or right now I'm feeling jealous, or whatever. Whatever negative emotion we have in our mind, first we have to recognize it, then we have to accept it. Yes, this is what I'm feeling. Not pretend I'm not feeling that. That's what I'm feeling. This unease inside me, what is causing this? And really look and try to find what's the cause of this feeling inside me right now. And then we have to decide what to do about it. Which, of course, again, is very much part of the path. How to take negative emotions and deal with them skillfully. And so there are so many different methods depending on our ability to deal with the mind. Some people have a lot of understanding of their mind, so they can very quickly avert negative emotions and transform them into positive ones. Other people, because they don't have control, then they're still overwhelmed by their negative emotions. So then it's much more difficult just to say, right, I'm not going to be angry, I'm going to be patient and full of loving kindness. That's very nice, but I'm